new in this program and already some of you returning to school and maybe not clear about what the expectations are around writing. How do you write in the expressive arts? How do you write as a counseling psychologist? And here we are kind of throwing, as we would say in England, a spanner in the works already, like already throwing in a wrench, right? Throwing in the wrench and wanting to bring you into the edge of the arc of where we're going in the 21st century in academia, which is to say, how do you write yourself and write academically? How is writing, the art of writing yourself into the world and the world into you? And with poetry, I'm looking at Mambi, with poetry, with the arts, with the artistic eye and ear and heart, without losing the larger message that you're weaving your own story into a larger social story. And that's the essence of what autoethnography is about and what you're going to be working on this semester. And we are particularly fortunate to have Joy because this is what you do from a different point of view, right? From a different disciplinary perspective, actually, which is also part of the beauty of this work, to be able to collaborate with you. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks. It's really, really great to be here, and it's also really scary. Because when I was here last year, I was actually having a very difficult time teaching my own courses at Stern. And I was starting to think, maybe I've just lost it. Like, it's just not working anymore. And why did it ever work? And then I came here, and it was such an incredible group of students who were so serious about putting themselves on the line because you want to heal. You want to heal others. So there was this incredible openness and willingness to take risks and willingness to listen to one another. And it was actually, when I went back, I told everybody, I just had the ultimate teaching experience. It can't be better than that. I think if it's better than that, then everybody walks out and you're ascended to the next plane of existence. I don't know what possibly could have gone better. And, so that's what a great memory to have. Now here I am again. So, this is different, and I'm different, and you guys are different people. However, I have to say, you're no less exciting to get to meet. So I'm really, really happy to be here. And it's totally fine if you make me feel like I'm a much better teacher than I actually am. Again, go for it. That would be awesome. But what we're going to be talking about and doing is, it's hard stuff. And in a way, the piece of it that I was thinking about, in addition to what Shoshana was saying, it's probably obvious to you guys, is that when you're doing therapy, I think whatever form of therapy you're doing, you're trying to help people who are deeply drowning in themselves, in their stories, in their own context, and unable to see how things fit together, and you're trying to help them tell the story of themselves. So the autoethnography exercise that you're doing here is practice in how hard it is for the people that you're going to be working with to do the same thing. Because when people are in pain, when people are struggling, when our lives aren't working, it's usually a whole combination of stuff. Because we respond to what's going on in our lives with so many different pieces of ourselves. We respond with what we got or didn't get from our families. We respond with, sometimes our cultures make us hyper-aware of things, sometimes they make us oblivious to things. We respond with our feelings of difference and otherness, the places that we feel alienated from everyone, and we respond with the wishes that we have for a kind of connection that really, codependency is the sort of wish. Like, I'm a recovering codependent, so, there are wishes sometimes that we have that we weren't different at all. That there's some kind of perfect love emerging, and we bring this whole mess to a therapist, and they say, "So, what brings you here today?" And I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I remember when I started therapy when I was in San Francisco, I was having horrible fights with my wife, and I had this gender issue, And my father had stopped talking to me and never told anybody why. And what did bring me there? I don't know. I didn't know how those things fit together. I didn't know if they fit together. Did it matter that I'd grown up Jewish and lower middle class? I didn't know. Did it matter that I was married to a working class Italian woman? I'm not sure. Did it matter that I wasn't happy in the job that I was doing? How was the way that I was at my job, how did it relate to the way I was at home? Right? So I didn't know any of that stuff, and of course my therapist didn't know any of that stuff either. And she could never tell me, because it was my story. I was going to have to figure out, through working with her, I was going to have to figure out to see how these different threads connected together, and I was going to have to learn techniques for not finding the story or the answer, but figuring out that there were a lot of ways that I could tell my story. There were a lot of different ways that I could understand the way things weren't working for me, the suffering that I was inflicting and the suffering that I was feeling. That it wasn't that there was sort of one way of looking at something and I needed someone to give it to me, but I needed to be taught some powerful tools for looking at and understanding and telling the story of myself. So I think the autoethnography exercise is an exercise in having you do that kind of work with self-awareness. Because it's hard, right? What you're asked your clients to do is really hard. And encountering the difficulties in writing is one of the great things about writing. So I grew up, I lived in poetry, and I saw somebody else maybe who does the same thing. And I was very impatient, because what I wanted was, I just wanted to write great poetry. And I didn't want to really work at it so much. So there were different ways to do that. Most of them involved lying to myself. Sometimes it was, well, I'll just wait till I feel like writing, and then I'll write, and I'll feel great about it, and I won't show anyone, so I don't have to know if anybody disagrees or agrees, or I'll read it over and over until it's sort of ingrained in my brain and it feels like these words can't come out any other way. But as I grew up as a poet, I realized that the difficulties in poems were really profound difficulties there were real questions. There were real questions I had about life. Like, what image, when do I end the poem with this image, was a question about, well, what's the final truth of this particular story? What kind of truth is it? Is it a complicated truth? Is it a simple truth? Do I want it to feel conclusive or inconclusive, and why? And I started to realize that this had to do with the shape of my experience of life. And so when I was working on poems, and my then wife, who was a fiction writer, she used to laugh at me all the time. She's like, "You really care about line breaks, don't you?" Like, that seemed really dumb to her. But yeah, I would move it around, and I realized there was kind of a lot at stake in, is it a long line? Is it a short line? Does it have this rhythm? Does it have that rhythm? I couldn't always say what it was, but the shaping of the poem was also the shaping of myself. And trying to rush through that, trying in fact not to be present for it, just have the poem happen and we're done, wham bam, thank you poem. That was actually missing the whole adventure. So this assignment is really hard, and the difficulty of the assignment is the best thing about it. I'm not grading you, so I get to say this, but for me, this really seems like the journey is the important thing in this piece of writing. If you come, I'm not sure what the greatest autoethnography in the world would look like, but whether you come out with that, or whether you come out with something that you're really unhappy with as a piece of writing, if you do this right, it won't matter, because you will have learned the important things that there are to learn. Because the important things that there are to learn are about how to look at your own life, make decisions about what you see there, and learn some powerful tools for articulating it and arranging it and seeing it in relation to things, and then putting it, moving the lens backward and putting your life in the context of things that seem maybe larger and abstract, both the discourse of psychology, ideas about ethnicity or social organization, right? So if you do that right, you live through it right, I think the amount of learning and and self-transformation you will have will be great. And if you suffer, you get an extra bonus, because when your clients are suffering, when you're asking them questions they can't answer, when you're saying, okay, so just draw how you feel, and they can't draw anything, you're going to know how they feel. You're going to know what that's like. You're going to know how much is at stake for them. And they will know you know. They'll feel you there with them. So really, I much prefer giving writing assignments than doing them. So this is easy for me to say, I know this. But really try to live through this and enjoy it and embrace it as a process and wave at the jets, stuff like that. And not stress about the product. Because you, and really you as a therapist, that's the product, and that's, you're going to be baking for a long time now. So this is really a step on the way. And you want to come out of it with tools and self-awareness, but it's a beginning. It's not an end in itself. Shoshana, correct me if I'm wrong.
Absolutely.
You know, when I say this to my comp students, and, well, first of all, they don't believe me, but they also, and I know that, but I get grade them and all this stuff, but here I feel totally free to say this, because number one, it really is true, and number two, I don't have to be around for the end of it, so I'm just on your side, it's going to cheer you on, and then I'm going to wave goodbye.
Thank you. I'm going to send them to you.
Oh, okay, we can discuss that. So I wanted to check in with you guys first. I understand that you all read and looked at the writing assignments that I gave. And I know that you also had a lot of other things to do, and then not everybody came in here having done that writing. And that's cool, but it will really help me figure out how to do the class if I get a sense of who's done what. So whatever you've done, it's okay, unless you actually didn't get the assignment and haven't thought about it, that wouldn't be okay. But don't lie about that either, it's the truth, we'll deal with that. So how many people just read the assignment and that was it? Ish? Okay. How many people wouldn't go like this? You read the assignment, you really thought about it, you like made some kind of a start, but you didn't feel like you ended up doing the assignment. You're somewhere in process with it. Okay, great. And how many people feel like you did the assignment? Ish, okay.
I didn't make it to the second half.
Okay.
But I wanted to take my time.
Yes.
So I just put a lot of energy into myself and did what I could with that. And then,
Yes.
read the second half and thought about it, but I just didn't have time.
Absolutely. That's I don't know how your school works. So when you're doing writing projects, finishing things is important, but it actually doesn't help to finish if you haven't done it. Right? So you got to really live through it. So my students will turn in finished papers, but they haven't actually thought about anything. So the good news is, yes, you met the deadline. The bad news is, you didn't say anything. So if you got to pick one or the other, you actually want to do the work and think about it. And also, being responsible for your own process as a writer and as a person is really important. Like, you're the one who knows what's real and what's memorized. Right? You know, if you've gotten this far in life, we all probably know how to fake it more or less, but that's not good. So that's terrific that you figured out how to really do it. And the second half is really a tough part. It's a leap, and the first part is the foundation, the building block of it. So so that's cool. So it looks like we have a majority of people who've done some substantial writing, and pretty much everybody else thought about it to some extent. That's helpful. So I guess what I'd like to do, well, I wanted to say something about the writing assignment, and then I'd like to read an essay that I wrote called Coincidentally, Learning to Say I Again, Writing Activities for Identity Reconstruction. because it's a kind of writing that's akin to what you were doing, but it ends with specific things about writing that can do this. And the premise of what I'm going to read to you is that when you're writing about yourself, you're actually writing yourself into existence. And therefore, when you change the words around, you're experimenting with different forms of yourself. So I'll read that to you, and then I want to ideally talk with you or hear of some of the writing that you've done, and we'll talk about how some of these techniques might work for you. But I wanted to say about the writing assignments that came from me. One of the things that is really difficult in school is that often assignments are given to us from a teacher's point of view, and the teacher is thinking, here's what I want it to look like at the end. And if you're like me, you're overwhelmed, because you have no clue how to get from where you are to what the teacher is describing as the end point. And so when I teach people to teach writing, I always recommend that you try to break things down into steps, right? Because actually, writing is a process, and you can't do all of it at once. And it's really helpful to know that what you're writing is not the finished thing, because that freaks everybody out. If everything that you say has to be the thing, it's not going to happen. I mean, I think God would never finish the Ten Commandments unless God could say, yeah, it's a draft, they're going to break them anyway. So you have to be able to deal with writing as a process that is provisional and that has bite-sized steps, and where you don't have to do it all at once, and you give yourself permission to do it the real way and the right way, and to struggle with it. And I think, I think you're going to find the same sort of thing in therapy. Like, people will sometimes present you with a crisis, and they want the answer to it all at once, and you have to remember not to buy into that. That you really can't do any real process or any real relationship all at once. It doesn't happen. It's like me wanting to write great poetry and get rid of the paperwork. It really is going to happen a little bit at a time, and maybe frustratingly little at a time. And so part of what I'd like you to do is practice having faith in that with yourself. Right? This, whatever it ends up being, is going to come out a little at a time. There's going to be long periods of time where you don't know what the whole is going to be, or will there be a whole? Will I ever get done to this? I spent 8 years on part 1. Will I ever get to part 2? Right? So some other part of you needs to be there saying, you know what? Have faith in the process. Right? You're doing what you have to do, and you're under guidance of people who are helping you do what you need to do, and you're doing it the best you can. It's going to be okay. Okay. Are there questions at this point before I dive into another long story thing? Okay, cool. So I just published a memoir, which I conveniently left on the table. I'm really bad at this book selling thing, but anyway. It's called Through the Door of Life, A Jewish Journey Between Genders. And this essay, so it looks like I wrote a book, but actually I did what I now realize is an exercise in autoethnography. So this is what it looks like when it's a book, and it's marketed as a memoir, and that makes it sound like I sat down to tell the story of my life. But that's a lie. The truth is, when I realized that I was going to stop living as a guy and needed to start living as a woman, I realized I had no clue what that meant. And I had no clue who I was. And the only thing I knew was that I really liked writing. And writing was safe, unlike pretty much everything else that I was going to do in this intermediate process. And so I wrote this book really as a way of trying to write myself into existence and experiment with it. And it was great. I could revise myself. I could do things. So this essay is kind of about things that I learned from that process of trying to write a self into existence. Learning to say I again, writing activities for identity reconstruction. Identity is the sense that no matter what changes we experience as we live and age, the essence of ourselves remains the same. Many circumstances shore up a sense of identity. If you live a long time in one area, if you keep doing familiar roles, if you do the same job and have the same relationships, externals like that reinforce our sense that we're the same person from one day and year to the next. But the most profound anchor of our identity is something we don't usually experience as external: our physical selves, our bodies. Whatever the flux in our circumstances, we count on our bodies to assure us that no matter what else may have changed, we're still ourselves. As a transsexual who's always lived in a body that in many ways doesn't feel like mine, I've made an involuntary study of the interdependence between the sense of body and the sense of self. Strip away skin and bone, the distinctive shiver of vocal cords, every gesture that expresses your identity, and what you have left is what, during my life as a man, I meant when I said I. For decades, I lived at such a distance from my body that nothing that it did or was seemed to have anything to do with who I was. In my mid-40s, I suddenly couldn't live with that distance anymore. A voice was coming out of my throat, but it wasn't mine. When my children wrapped their arms around me, they seemed to be hugging someone else. Every morning I woke up smothered in flesh I couldn't recognize. This isn't me, I said to myself. This isn't me, I said to anyone I trusted. But actually there was no me, no identity that could tie together my body and mind. There are medical protocols for the treatment of transsexuality, although many trans people would object to the idea that this is even a medical condition requiring treatment. But I was a mess, and I certainly wanted treatment, and plenty of it, and for free. By the way. But I haven't come across any protocols for how to reconstruct an authentic sense of self when the identity-maintaining mind-body relationship is ruptured. Transsexuality is pretty rare, but physical illness and traumas that rupture the mind-body relationship, unfortunately, aren't. When the bodies that make us visible to ourselves in the world suddenly change, our sense of self can be shaken at the most visceral level. As I've found in my own journey, writing can help us find our way back from traumatic dissociation to a sense of identity. Of course, it's not news that telling the story of a distressing event can help us pull ourselves together, as we say. I love that phrase. Most talking therapies are based on the idea that self-narration is a primary means of psychological healing. According to the philosopher Daniel Dennett, narrative itself is so powerfully self-constituting that our sense of identity is nothing more than a byproduct of our internal narration. He says, really the only reason we say I is because you can't tell a story without a point of view. And we can't live without telling the story of what we're living through, and so we end up feeling like there's an I. He's a philosopher, so this doesn't bother him. Whatever we think of Dennett's claims, it's clear that telling a story about ourselves has enormous implications in terms of identity. Even a simple narrative like, I went for a walk in the rain, and now I'm soaked to the skin, implies that I know who I was and who I am, and that despite the differences in perspective and situation, there's a fundamental identity between the past and present versions of myself, so I can refer to both the self that went out for a walk and the self that came back soaking wet as I. Right? And imagine that if you didn't have a sense of identity, you'd be like, well, I was a dry person when I left, but now I'm a wet person when I come back. And that's a silly example, but if you think about vets who go to war and come back, for other people it's like, yeah, you were gone 18 months, and for them it's like, no. You know, when I went out I was this kind of person, and now I am someone else. But they use the same pronoun, I, and we use the same name for them. And it becomes very, very difficult for them to tell that story and for other people to even understand what's going on. So the very forces that create a sense of identity, which is normally a good thing, when you're traumatized, when you don't feel like you're yourself anymore, those forces in language and in routine and in rhythm, they really mess you up. because they keep insisting that you're the same person, and you keep feeling like you're really not. So, physical trauma, in fact, can rupture our sense of identity so much that we don't even feel that there's a single pronoun that can honestly refer to our past and present selves. For example, when I speak of my life as a man before my transition, I run into some real problems of reference. I'm not a man anymore. In fact, I now have changed my syntax, right? So I try to get away from this whole thing. I say, when I lived as a man, and now that I live as a woman, or now that I live as myself, because the whole am thing is really a problem. Like, wait, was I a man? Like, if I was a man, how could I not be a man now? And am I a woman? Well, I don't want to have that fight, because, you know, a lot of people would fight with me about that, so let's just stick to the facts. I lived this way, and now I live that way. I went out in the rain, now I'm wet. The question of whether I ever was that man involves complexities of psychology, epistemology, and metaphysics that seem to define narration, and they certainly are conversation stoppers. So when you're doing an autoethnography, one of the reasons that you need to go from what might seem like the easy part, telling the true story about yourself, to the hard part, which is connecting that to abstractions and ways of thinking about society in general, or the way the psyche is connected, is in fact, you're not simple. You're complicated. There are real questions about whether when you're the same person that you always were when you were 18 months old, and when you were 18 years old, and when you're today. There are a lot of different dimensions that we have, and the simple language that we use to tell the story of ourselves often makes it hard to register the full richness and complexity and indefiniteness of who we are. Because there's a general understanding that gender is a defining aspect of identity, most people seem to understand that I'm identity challenged. But there isn't really a general understanding that identity is affected by amputation, or paralysis, or disfigurement, or chronic illness, or other life-altering physical traumas. And I at least have different words, man and woman, for the different versions of myself. But what words do we have to differentiate our able-bodied selves from who we are after physical trauma? I don't even know if that vocabulary really exists. As Frank Bedard's extraordinary poem, The Ark, Frank's local, by the way, he was a great poet, written in the voice of a man who lost his arm, shows, the lack of language for such trauma-ruptured selves can point to profound difficulties in locating ourselves in relation to existence. And Frank Bedard is one of the great writers of persona poems, so he writes as people he isn't, but he does it so convincingly that pretty much everybody thinks that he's all the people that he writes about. So when I met him, this is a poem about a man with one arm, and there's another great poem about an anorexic woman, and there was another one about a necrophiliac child rapist. So when I met him, I was like, uh-oh, you know, what's this guy gonna look like? Because he really sounded like all of those. Yeah. And then he was like this California guy, and you know, he wanted to go VCR shopping. That was a new technology then. Yeah, it was weird. It was weird because he just wasn't weird. Anyway, so here's from the poem. Since the accident, I had gotten more and more obsessed. The image of what I had been, the anticipations, demands, and predilections of a two-armed man haunted me. I was no longer whole, proportioned, inviolate. One day, I saw a black dog and a young boy madly running. Nothing unusual, except the dog had only one front leg. He seemed without consciousness of what he lacked, free of memory as a vegetable. Looking at each other, they happily jogged along, started to cross the bridge, and I followed. And then, as I crossed it, suddenly I felt that I too must erase my past, that I must pretend, almost as an experiment, I had never had more than one arm, that the image faced in the mirror was the inevitable image. for a time, it worked. I was happy. Without a past, I seemed not to exist in time at all. I only remember a sense of release, ease, proportion. I am now one, not less than one. Then, after about 2 weeks, imperceptibly, everything I saw became cardboard. Even the things I touched, I couldn't allow myself to remember the vivid associations which gave dimension to what I touched, saw, smelt. The resonance of every image I had to try to cut from my brain. It had been felt by someone with 2 hands and 2 arms. I had to try to cut from my brain my phantom hand, which still gets cramps, which my brain still recognizes as real. The Dart speaker struggles with the disjunction between the 1- and 2-armed versions of himself. The psychic cost of trying to reconcile these versions into a single identity is so great that he tries to jettison the former 2-armed self, to erase that portion not only of his brain's map of his body, but of his memories of how he used to experience the world, the vivid associations which gave dimension to what I touched, saw, smelt. In a sense, he's trying to break up with his past, right? So you go through a breakup and you destroy everything, you don't want to remember, but yeah, if it was a good relationship, you're going to lose a lot of yourself if you refuse to remember or do anything that you did with the person that you broke up with, right? And that's kind of what is happening to him. The Dart's writing fiction. He really does have 2 arms. I've seen him. But many transsexuals actually try out similar strategies, abandoning homes, families, jobs, friendships, to erase the pre-transition selves that threaten our new identities. Right? If I stand here and say, I used to live as a man, then there are very few people who are going to say, oh yeah, now you're really a woman. Right? So I have this weird choice. Do I forget my first 45 years or so? Do I lie about it? Do I erase it? Do I say it was a mistake? It happened to somebody else, dissociate myself from it? Or do I say somehow I'm both, even though I actually don't understand how that's possible even myself? I mean, this is really, it's a problem for me. I don't know how to refer to most of my life. I remember it in the 3rd person, but it was me, it was mine. As Bedard suggests, the struggle to reconcile past and present versions of the main self can be so painful that it can seem better not to claim the past self at all. If you are never whole, then you can't be less than one. But Bedard's speaker finds that erasure of the past self makes a full, vivid, not to mention honest, life impossible. It's not healing, it's amplification of trauma. Right? So part of what my therapists irritatingly say to me is, we're not here to make you feel better. We're here to enable you to feel the full richness of yourself as a person, as a human being. And a lot of that richness hurts. It sucks. But it's yours. You're entitled to it. And we're going to help you develop the strength and tools in order to not to endure it and to embrace it and to really celebrate it because, the full spectrum of humanness, it's good. It's good to be human. But if there's going to be a whole post-traumatic self, the new sense of identity has to encompass rather than deny the trauma that estranged us from ourselves. The Dart speaker doesn't quite make it to wholeness, but he realizes that wholeness can exist. And this is the way the poem ends. And now I think of Paris, how Paris is still the city of Louis XVI and Robespierre, how blood, amputation, and rubble give her dimension, resonance, and grace. The premise of identity reconstruction writing activities is that identity, and Bedard's speaker uses Paris's identity as a metaphor because he's not really able to do it with his own, can arise from acknowledgement and embrace of the very blood, amputation, and rubble that seem to make a whole sense of self impossible. Writing can help those whose identities have been destabilized by physical trauma learn to tell the stories of lives that no longer seem to have a story, to find ways of naming ourselves and our lives that acknowledge traumatic rupture as an aspect of, rather than an erasure of who we are. For example, like many male to female transsexuals, I struggle with how to understand my boyhood as part of my identity as a woman. And since I wrote this, I have to tell you, I meet these incredible people now as part of my, they didn't tell me that would happen with transition, but I did. So this woman calls me up, and she's the mom of this adopted child from China. And as soon as the child learned to speak, she said, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy, as soon as they had enough English. And this mom said, like, okay, you're 4 years old, you just learned English, I believe you. And she is like creating this whole, she is just reinforcing this. Okay, this is your truth, and I'm going to be there for you. So she teaches her children, some boys are born with penises, some boys are born with vaginas. And, she's like the hero of all these traumatized trans guys. We're like, why wasn't my mama like this? She didn't tell me that. So she's actually trying to avoid any traumatic rupture. She's just saying, hey, you don't need any new words. You are just fine with who you are. This is part of the range of what it means to be a boy and a man. But that was like not my world, and it's not most of our worlds at the moment. Even now, referring to my boyhood feels dangerous. An admission that my identity as a woman is brittle, hollow, a charade. I could just change the words I use when I talk about growing up. Say, when I was a girl instead of when I was a boy. Revising pronouns, anecdotes, even memories to give myself a rhetorical girlhood. And some of my friends who are really strong allies, they do that. They refer to me as she when I was a boy, which I find really confusing. It's really sweet, but I don't even know if it's right. You say, is that right? I don't know. I was not she when I grew up. Nobody ever called me she, so I wish. But like the darts speaker's attempt to think of himself as always one-armed, that would require me to sacrifice the texture of my childhood, the vivid associations I experienced as a boy, and which still resonate in my life. And the truth is, I didn't grow up as a girl. I didn't do girl things. I did boy things. I didn't necessarily like it, but that's what I did. So if I want the vivid associations of that, if I want to even remember my childhood at all, I have to kind of own that, even though it seems to erase my sense of who I am. When, at the prompting of my therapist, I started writing what would eventually become that memoir down there, I started to describe my past in writing. I found that the very aspects of language that threaten my identity when I talk about my childhood gave me powerful tools for reconstructing my sense of self. So here's a chunk of that writing. I spent my childhood trying to be what people wanted me to be. I'm still angry at that miserable, self-betraying boy who never managed to find the courage to tell anyone he was other than he seemed to be. Maybe I should be more forgiving. He was, after all, only a kid. In preschool, he had literally run after girls, desperate to find a way to join them. They screeched and ran away, claiming he was trying to kiss them. By kindergarten, he'd learned to turn away whenever he glimpsed anything, a doll or a dress or girls laughing with each other, which might compromise the facade of maleness. Of course, he was a strange boy. Everyone agreed about that. But he found ways to get by. In 5th grade, he called himself a pacifist so he wouldn't have to fight, and got beaten up every day by a gang that wanted to see if he would stay a pacifist when they were pummeling his head and back. He never told anyone. He didn't care how much things hurt, a fact his parents almost discovered one night when they saw him carrying a dinner plate in the wrong hand. He'd broken his wrist when he ended up at the bottom of a pile during Kill the Kid with the Ball, and kept on playing. It never occurred to him to stop. Hurting himself felt good. It was a kind of revenge on the body that was always hurting him, a way of showing how little he and his body meant to each other. Most self-descriptions are written in the first person. In fact, like autoethnography, you would figure isn't going to be in the first person. But if you had just been given the assignment to write an ethnography, you would figure it would be in the third person. Right? That's part of what's, doing Zen koan thing in this assignment. It's like mixing two kinds of discourse, the academic and the personal. But when you're writing a memoir, when your therapist says write about your childhood, you're really supposed to say I. But for those whose identities are destabilized by bodily trauma, using the first person can feel like a false assertion of the coherence between past and present. Before my transition, I tried to avoid the first person at all in my writing. Even in conversation, I tried to avoid self-falsification by not talking about myself. And people really like that when you just say, let's talk about you. You know, so that was good. And for a guy to say, let's talk about you, that was wow. You know? I'm like, where'd you come from? And how long can I talk to you? When my therapist first suggested that I write an autobiography, I refused. I told her, autobiography requires having a life to write about and a self to write it. And I never felt I had either. After a few more sessions, though, I realized that if I wanted to stop feeling like a persona and start feeling like a person, I had to find ways to talk about my life as though it were mine. And the passage I just read you marked a breakthrough in that struggle. Articulating the long-buried truth about my cravenness as a child, I spent my childhood trying to be what people wanted me to be, opened a long-locked gate inside me, releasing my anger at the miserable, self-betraying boy who'd been so dishonest. Once that anger emerged into the light of words and syntax and narrative, I was face to face with the trauma that made it so hard for me to have a sense of self. The fact that I had lived so long as someone I wasn't, as someone I despised myself for being. The pronoun I couldn't reflect that trauma. And so, to my surprise, I found myself referring to my child self in the third person, which I'd never felt allowed to do before. The pronoun he gave me a new liberating honesty, a way of simultaneously acknowledging the maleness of my child self and distancing myself from it. So this was like I was telling the truth in some weird way. Paradoxically, disowning that child self brought me closer to him. The problem of reference, the feeling that I couldn't talk about my past self in the first person because it implied an identity I didn't experience as true, had silenced me. And that silence had crystallized my alienation from my past. If I couldn't speak of my life or myself, they clearly weren't mine. Despite the distancing masculine pronoun, the act of narrating his life demonstrated my identification with that boy. Only I knew why he had let himself be beaten up, or why he kept playing after breaking his wrist. Writing about my boyhood as though it wasn't mine helped me recognize the ways in which it was. Finally, I'd started to tell the truth about my life, including the alienation and anger that had always undermined my sense of identity. And as I began to tell the truth in all of its strange, traumatized dissociation, it began to feel like my life. In fact, as you probably noticed, my narration about that boy's physical dissociation has a distinct note of pride to it. That boy wasn't only a craven self-betrayer. He had silently endured being beaten up rather than fight like a man. He played through pain that would have sidelined real boys. Like me, what a male set of values, right? Like me, my present-day self, he was ready to suffer in order to express his distance from the male body he'd been given. So by starting at that intense distance from myself, the longer I told that story, the closer I got to the boy that I didn't want to own up to having been. So writing is a process, not a panacea. It takes more than a paragraph or two to develop a female identity that can encompass 4.5 decades of living as a male. In fact, it probably takes more than that book. But we can't become who we are if we can't articulate the truth about who we've been. Shame is a powerful obstacle to identity reconstruction because it makes us prefer a state of fragmentation to a wholeness that would identify us with what we're ashamed of. I was ashamed of myself for being a boy, and I was ashamed of myself for pretending to be a boy. I was ashamed of my success at living as a male because that success seemed to prove that I wasn't really female, even though that was my gender identity. So I was just ashamed of everything, coming and going. Writing enabled me to confront that shame in ways that I shied from even in therapy. I really liked my therapist, but I wasn't about to start referring to myself in the third person lest she and I think I was crazy, right? So when you talk to somebody, that's a social act. Even if your therapist says, you can say anything here, you know, you're still a person talking to another person. And I didn't know if I could talk this way and really like be a person, be a sane person. So writing was a way of getting this stuff into language, which was really necessary for me, but it wasn't getting into language as a social action. I didn't have to show that to anybody. I mean, obviously, now I'm trying to show it to everybody, but I didn't have to. And that's also true of the work you're doing on your autoethnographies. You may write some things about yourself that are really important for you to realize, to know, and then you don't include. You had to write them, you had to know them, you have to free yourself and make a safe space for yourself in this work so that you can have access to all of the stuff that you are, no matter how hard or shameful or painful or messy. But then this is the great thing about writing. You don't have to show it to people, you know? Shoshana is not going to grade you on. It seems to me that you left a trauma out on page 4. Could you put that in? Right? She's not going to do that. In fact, you might find yourself writing about, not about the stuff you left out, but about why you left some stuff out. Right? Either way, whatever you do, you need to make it yours. You need to claim all of yourself and find ways to do that. And then you need to claim the power of revision and self-presentation. And you need to separate those. You need to say, some of the writing I do is self-presentation. I'm handing this in, I'm reading it out loud. And some of the writing I do is I am discovering myself, I'm creating myself, I'm going places I've never dared to go before, and I have no clue whether I'm willing to let anybody else see this. And I promise myself I'm not going to show anyone else unless I really decide that it's safe and desirable to do so. So the great thing about writing is writing can be erased and hidden and edited. When you do that out loud in speech, you risk being called a liar. Just ask Mitt Romney. Now, if I was his writing teacher, I would say, you've done some great self-revision there, Mitt. And I know that it doesn't add up. I know it doesn't add up to a whole identity, but that's okay. You know, you're just like a traumatized self here. And I respect the wholeness of that traumatized self. I don't want it for president, but you know, you're so entitled to it. And in fact, that is what a lot of people are saying. They're saying, like, one of the weird things about Mitt Romney is he doesn't seem to admit that all of this stuff doesn't add up. But actually, he's not the only one. Because I think most of us have these contradictory pieces of ourselves, and we sort of shift from one to another. We're like sometimes such a different person in different contexts, and we're the only audiences, and so we never get called on it, right? But inside, we have this question of like, well, what do I mean by I? How does this all add up? And sometimes it really doesn't. But that doesn't mean it's not part of you. It doesn't mean it's not yours, and it doesn't mean that you can afford to avoid recognizing the discontinuities and paradoxes that are part of you. That means when you change the story of your lives on the page, and I'm hoping that you guys do that when you're working on this autoethnography, I'm hoping it doesn't all come out right the first time. Because when you do that, you're going to see that you can use the written word to safely, morally, and without transmitting sexual diseases, explore the provisional nature of identity. Right? That's an abstract idea, but identity really is, it's like something we do rather than something we are in some ways. And in writing, you get a chance to see how that actually works. Wow, if I leave that in, I seem like this person. If I take it out, I seem like that person. If I had started that paragraph by talking about how well I withstood pain and ended by what a coward I was, I would be really presenting a different self to you. Right? So the turn of a word or sentence can alter not only who we are, but who we were. There was a Czech saying, I think it was developed under communism, there's nothing so hard to predict as the past. And of course in a communist society, they would just change the past, But really, I think that's a lot of the way identity works. It's a way that we keep changing the past without telling ourselves that we're any different. And you need to know what that is, and you need to use it, not be afraid of it. Because otherwise it's hard to help other people claim that power. The tragically disabled Israeli poet Rachel began one poem by saying, "I can only tell you what I know about myself. My expertise in using writing to reconstruct identity is purely personal. It's cobbled together from the writing I've done and the literature I've read, and my experience is mentoring a few student writers coping with trauma. I don't know enough to, I'm not a therapist, so I don't have a writing regimen and make people do this and then they'll come out whole even if they're traumatized. I don't know. I don't have that. But I do have 3 elements of writing. They're very simple, but they're very powerful tools that can be used for helping people reconstruct identities that have been ruptured by trauma. So I want to talk about them. The first one is naming. Naming is the most fundamental power of writing. Ancient magical traditions teach that to name something is to have power over it, to be able to summon it, to order it, to put it in its place. Adam's first action, the first human action recorded in Genesis, is naming the animals, an activity he undertakes in order to determine where he fits among them. Remember Adam's lonely and he's looking for somebody? It's like, hamster, no, not you. Next. So it's like computer dating. Wait, do you smoke, salamander? Hey, no, I'm weird. I told you that. It's By naming the animals, Adam is really naming himself. But by naming what you aren't, you're naming who you are. So here's another passage from the book. What's in those, my friend asks. Birdseed, I answer. Birdseed and pantyhose. She laughs. She can't help it. We're talking about my breasts. For a trans girl on my budget, $0. Birdseed and pantyhose is the best option for low-maintenance, relatively authentic-looking breasts. Hormone therapy won't start in earnest till next month, and no one knows how long it will take before my body starts changing. My breasts, the snipped, filled feet of cheap hose that turned out not to fit in the palm of one of my hands. I wrote this paragraph shortly after the conversation. As a poet dabbling in prose, I was very pleased by the snappy dialogue. Don't tell me if it's not snappy. I'm still pleased by it, and I just wanted to snap it. But as a traumatized transsexual making her first claims to female identity, all I cared about were 2 words: my breasts. I'd never said or written those words before. I'd never claimed any breasts as my own, and I considered it outrageously brave to do so when the breasts in question were made out of birdseed and pantyhose. They were mine, but could I really call them breasts? That was something I'd never done, even in the privacy of a word processing document. I'd never named my tentative, absurdly artificial femininity as real, as proof of my female identity, rather than proof that I could never have one. Naming ourselves, learning to say I in ways that acknowledge and encompass even the most traumatizing aspects of our experience, is the whole point of identity reconstruction writing activities. But to begin reconstructing identities, traumatized writers need to be able to name ourselves in ways that suspend or even deny implications of wholeness that we don't feel. Right? So you can't use a name that implies that you're a whole person if you don't feel like you're a whole person. So if you're traumatized and somebody says, "You're okay, you're a human being, you're not ripped in 2. Thank you for sharing. That did not heal me." Right? That's not a name that has power in my world, because the words are not corresponding to my experience of existence. And until I find those magic names, I can't start putting them in sentences and revising them and claiming power over them. So it was hard for me to name those bags of birdseed my breasts, because to do so I had to confront the inescapable brokenness that's part of who I am. The fact that as a transsexual, I can only become a woman by doing things that other women, born women, real women, would never do. If brokenness is what we know of ourselves, then brokenness is the self that we need to name. that's harder than it sounds, because writing is generally associated with wholeness. I know it's a weird thing to say, but writing encapsulates what we know. In fact, the hardest thing for inexperienced writers is that they think of writing as the end product. You figure everything out and then you write it down. And that was probably the way it worked in the days of cuneiform tablets. I don't think there were a lot of free writing activities, just took a little too long. But, I mean, we live in the age of the most malleable forms of print that you can possibly have. It's really easy to revise and change things. And it really is true that we can delight in the fact that writing is a process, that you actually think through writing, you become through writing, or in my case, you heal yourself and discover yourself through writing. So if I waited to figure out who I was and then write my memoir, I would never have written it, because I would never have become the person who could write it. I can only become the person who could write it by the process of writing it, if that makes sense. So M.C. Escher was right with those hands. That we do sort of draw ourselves, drawing ourselves. And that's the way we come into existence. And no, it doesn't make any sense, but yeah, it does work. So we think of writing as encapsulating what we know, marking the completeness of our thinking, taking disparate events and turning them into a story, writing brokenly in a state of brokenness about aspects of ourselves that shatter our sense of self can seem terrifying, taboo, impossible. To help traumatized writers overcome such feelings, we need to offer them the kinds of activities many writers do to overcome writer's block. And I'm looking at my fellow poet here, right? So sometimes you want to write and you can't write. So you need to come up with something where it's not like, well, I'll either prove I'm a great poet or I'm a hack. Right? That's usually a recipe for writer's block. And you need to do something else, but you want to write. So you come up with low-stakes assignments. So, kinds of writing you can do where the whole world doesn't depend on how it comes out. Activities that feel like games, throwaways, jottings on which nothing at all depends. For example, you might invite a teenager to write as though texting to a friend in class, a mode whose extreme contractions and jagged, incomplete sentences can eloquently reflect trauma. Like, you don't even need pronouns, right? You don't need syntax. A harried parent might be encouraged to write a mock to-do or shopping list, jotting items like figure out self or find hope, and pick up the milk. Whatever the mode, the exercise should require nothing but the simplest meaning. No syntax, no spelling, right? You'd be amazed at how many people don't write because they just don't feel confident in their spelling. If the iPad can make mistakes in spelling, so can we. It doesn't have to be right, and it just has to be done. You have to set it up in a way that you can't fail. And I want you guys to do that with your steps toward your autoethnographies. I think that Shoshana would prefer sentences in what you turn in. Like when you're presenting this as a finished product, I doubt she would thank me if the result were just lists of words. She said to name. That won't do it. But that doesn't mean that that's not a crucial step. Like I said, step one, figure out, paradigmatic moments in your life. Well, heck, I don't know how to do that. I don't have a list, a place in my brain, a storage place of paradigmatic moments, right? You just need to start writing moments and see what happens. And you need to do it in a not very eloquent way. And you trust that as you do that process, something's going to kick in. You're going to start making decisions. But even if you just come up with a list of different moments in your life, you started naming things that somehow your mind brought you to as possible places for naming yourself and who you are and how to do this. So you don't need to turn that in. That's pre-writing. But that may be a crucial step. In fact, it might be the step that is the most crucial for you, even though it doesn't make it into the final paper. That might be the step where you remember something or realize the importance of something that you would never pick out on its own. The goal is just to name some aspect of ourselves or lives.